Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my tight end rankings tier list for the 2023 fantasy football season. Over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be mentioning my top 30 ranked tight ends as I present statistics and data that I've gathered this offseason in order to justify their current rankings. Now, as each tight end appears on screen, that is the order in which I would draft them going into my 2023 fantasy football leagues. Now, when I present statistics, mention them whether it is, fantasy points per game or in terms of their overall rankings, it is all for a half PPR scoring format. Again, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league. Now, the rankings that I do present over the course of the next, 30, 40, 50 minutes in which I talk about 30 different tight ends will potentially change between now and your upcoming draft. So in order to stay up to date on my latest rankings, be sure to subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2023 season, with the singular purpose of trying to help you win a fantasy football championship, just like a couple days ago in which we had Josh Jacobs ranked, but unfortunately we weren't 100% certain as to whether or not he would go back to the Las Vegas Raiders earlier today. As of the recording of this video, he is signed with the Las Vegas Raiders. It obviously adjusts his ranking far higher than where I originally had him because there was so much uncertainty regarding his situation. Now, besides the daily content that I'll be posting on this channel, for those of you who want additional advantages for your upcoming 2023 season, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, not only you're going to get a first-time deposit match up to $100, you're also going to get my 2023 fantasy football draft guide and rankings. Those rankings are up to date every single week throughout the entire month of August. So regardless of when you're drafting, you'll have by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, top 200 flex rankings available to you every single week. Again, for those of you who are wondering when the most recent update came out, it was earlier this morning around 5 a.m. I sent those out, so be sure to check your spam folder if you've gone ahead and signed up using code Andrew this offseason and made that first-time deposit. Thank you very much. Additionally, besides the draft guide that, of course, has all my methodology as to how I approach my 2023 drafts and all the statistics that justify those reasons, you're not only going to get the draft guide, the rankings, the updates, you're also going to get weekly rankings every single week from weeks 1 through 18 of the 2023 fantasy football season because, like I mentioned, the entire purpose of this channel is to help you win a fantasy football championship. So take advantage of the opportunity on hand. Get those rankings every single Sunday morning. Check your eligibility based on the map to the left side of the screen. Again, your current location determines that. So go ahead, take advantage of the opportunity, sign up using code Andrew, and get drafting today via Underdog Fantasy's multitude of best ball leagues. Thank you very much. Additionally, the last thing I want to mention before we get into talking about some of these tight ends, as of this current moment in time, the Andrew Kiorkof YouTube channel official merchandise line, the 1.01 brand is available now. Head on over to andrewkiorkofshop.com, link down in the description of the video, to go ahead and not only support the channel, but continue to rep greetings and salutations. Now, like I've said before in the past, the entire purpose of this merchandise line is to provide high quality, comfortable, and stylish clothing for your most stressful of upcoming fantasy football Sundays for the 2023 season. So go ahead, support the channel, and rep greetings and salutations on your chest like I currently am with a tie-dye hoodie. Again, these are in limited quantity, so go ahead, travel to the website and get them before they're all gone. Thank you very much for supporting. Now let's get into the content. All right, beginning with the number one tight end, of course, the only tight end that should be considered an S-tier player, the only tight end going in the first round, it is Travis Kelce. The primary reason he is a first-round selection is because his consistency of success in a half PPR scoring format has been able to score over 260 fantasy points in 2 out of the last 3 years. But his consistency doesn't just stop there. He's been the number one overall ranked tight end in 6 out of the last 7 seasons. He has not missed a game due to injury since 2013. He has scored 10-plus touchdowns in 4 out of the last 5 seasons. And, of course, has had 130 targets in each of the last 5 seasons. Now, with Tyreek Hill out of this lineup in 2022, obviously more opportunities went in the direction of Travis Kelce as he put up incredible statistics, but he's always been good with Patrick Mahomes. You go back and you look at 2020 through 2022, Travis Kelce with Patrick Mahomes under center in the regular season has averaged 15.38 fantasy points per game, and throughout that span of time has 16 games of over 100 receiving yards and only 10 games of less than 50 receiving yards. With a huge target vacancy from Juju Smith-Schuster and McCole Hardman leaving this organization, there is even more opportunity for Travis Kelce to maintain his number one tight end standing, as we all know, is rightfully a first-round selection. Moving on, let's talk about The A tier, and the only player that is going to be in this A tier, it is Mark Andrews. He is the only tight end over the course of the last 7 seasons who's been able to dethrone Travis Kelce as the #1 overall tight end in a given year. Obviously, this was in 2021. Mark Andrews, even with Tyler Huntley and Lamar Jackson both contributing to his overall success within that year, was able to dominate. Now, similar to Travis Kelce, we have seen a high level of consistency from Mark Andrews, specifically in the last 4 seasons, ranking as the #6 or better tight end every single year. In the last 2 years specifically, Mark Andrews has been averaging 12.8 fantasy points per game in the last 31 healthy regular season games he's played, and with Lamar averaging 12.5 fantasy points per game. Obviously had a stint of games at the back end of 2021 with Tyler Huntley where he was nuclear, but as long as, Lamar Jackson's healthy, the overall upside of this offense and their ability to score and find themselves in red zone opportunities, especially for Mark Andrews, who we want to see get back to that double-digit number in terms of scoring touchdowns this year, there's a higher likelihood as long as Lamar is under center, especially considering since 2019, Mark Andrews has had a 26.62% target percentage in terms of targets per route run. Additionally, has commanded a 25% red zone target share since 2019. Now you go ahead and change the offensive coordinator from Greg Roman, who has obviously implemented a run-first approach. Now you go to Todd Monken. So now we have a pass-happy offense, and the #1 receiving threat of this offense, Mark Andrews, should absolutely be able to benefit from that. Moving on, let's talk about the only tight end that I currently have in the C tier. Again, this is the reality of the tight end position. It is a huge bottleneck. There is consistency at the top, and then there's a bunch of random guys at the bottom that could end up having a great year, but often is difficult to predict because the main metric that kind of revolves around the tight end position is touchdown. Now, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we continue, but in regards to TJ Hockenson, he's one of these stud options because the opportunities there and his ability as a pass catcher is certainly above many of the other available tight end options for the 2023 season. Specifically, as soon as TJ Hockenson was traded from the Detroit Lions and joined the Minnesota Vikings last season, in the 10 games he played with the Minnesota Vikings, he was averaging 9.99 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format and was ranked as the #4 overall tight end in terms of fantasy points per game on average. Throughout that span of time, including the playoffs, he played 11 games with them, 8 of those 11 games consisting of 8 or more targets, and in those contests averaging 12.2 fantasy points per game. When you're able to get 8 or more targets 72% of the time with that organization, obviously we have a far higher potential for TJ Hockenson to find success in 2023 as they're trending in the direction of getting their tight ends far more implemented within the offensive scheme. I mean, as soon as he joined this organization from weeks 9 through 17 of the regular season, where the starters were completely there, because in week 18, they pulled the starters at the end of the first half. In terms of overall target percentages, the wide receiver position commanded 62.39% of the targets overall, while the tight end position commanded 25.93%, 91 targets compared to 219, which again, in terms of averages for TJ Hockenson, is only going to benefit his bottom line because the opportunity without a doubt is going to be there. Now, regardless of the fact that I've said TJ Hockenson has been great, has been averaging nearly 10 fantasy points per game, the question is, what is his capabilities going into 2023? Well, if you go ahead and take his pace of play and take the averages that he produced with the Minnesota Vikings last season in the 11 games he played with them, including the playoffs, we're talking about a tight end who has the potential of 150 targets, over 100 receptions, over 1,000 receiving yards, 5 receiving touchdowns, and over 180 fantasy points potential based on his averages from last year. We're talking about an offense that has a target vacancy of 199 targets with no more Adam Thielen, Irv Smith, or Dalvin Cook. You got to remember, Adam Thielen has scored 30 touchdowns in the last 3 seasons, 25 in which came from the red zone. If in fact TJ Hockenson is going to slip in and be the #1 receiving threat down in the red zone outside of Justin Jefferson, expect for him to score a lot of touchdowns and his fantasy production to continue to trend in the right direction. Moving on, let's talk about George Kittle. George Kittle last season benefited mainly because he was able to find the end zone as much as he did. He went ahead and set a career high in terms of receiving touchdowns, and a lot of that credit has to go towards Brock Purdy and the red zone opportunities that he was giving George Kittle throughout the span of time as soon as Purdy took over against the Miami Dolphins and then became the starter henceforth. Again, when Brock Purdy and George Kittle have been able to connect in the games which they've played together, George Kittle is averaging 14.25 fantasy points per game on average. That is a ridiculously high ceiling, and I don't expect George Kittle to be able to produce those kind of numbers because touchdowns are so volatile in the entire fantasy landscape. But when we talk about the consistency that George Kittle has been able to produce, regardless of who's played at quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, in specifically the last 5 seasons, he has been a top 4 ranked tight end in 4 of those 5 seasons. He would have honestly been a top 2 or 3 ranked tight end if he had not gotten injured in majority of those years. We know what kind of potential he has. Again, in the last 2 seasons, averaging 11.5 fantasy points per game, has dominated majority of the games against the NFC West. Again, when you get to play against the Rams, the Cardinals, and of course the Seahawks multiple times a year, it's great to see that George Kittle's averaging 15.26 fantasy points per game against those teams in the last 2 years. Even though this offense does not target their tight ends very much. In fact, they were ranked 25th amongst all teams in the last two seasons in terms of tight end overall targets, yet they were number 6 in tight end receiving yards and number 2 in tight end receiving touchdowns. That statistic primarily has to do with the fact that George Kittle, despite his lack of opportunity, is making plays after the catch and dominating, which he'll continue to do with Brock Purdy this year. Moving on, let's talk about Darren Waller, the only other player in the C tier. Going from the Las Vegas Raiders and joining the New York Giants shouldn't be much of a transition for Darren Waller, as he honestly should become the number 1 receiving threat of this offense, which again, he's used to doing when you go back to the days of 2019 and 2020 with the Las Vegas Raiders organization, and the fact that Derek Carr just littered him with targets and allowed him to reach his overall ceiling of success. I mean, we're talking about a tight end who was able to be top 3 in both 2019 and 2020 because of those opportunities. And when we go into 2023, like I mentioned, he should be the number 1 receiving option of this offense. When we've gone ahead and looked at the history of the tight end position, specifically over the course of the last 3 seasons, tight ends who have been the number 1 target getter within their offense, led the team in targets, typically on average score about 190 fantasy points within their given year. There have been 8 total tight ends in the last 3 years who've been able to accomplish that. And even tight ends who have been number 2 options in terms of total targets within their offense are averaging about 170 fantasy points. Either way, Darren Waller should have the potential of being a top 5 candidate as long as he stays healthy, especially considering Saquon Barkley led the New York Giants in total receiving targets last year. I mean, 76 targets going to Saquon Barkley. I honestly, truly do believe Darren Waller is capable of getting over 100 targets this year. And if he's able to continue his catch rate like we have seen in the past, about a 70 to 75% rate with Daniel Jones, he should very easily be a top 5 fantasy prospect, if not better, if he's able to find the end zone. We know that despite the injuries that he's dealt with in the last 2 years, is still averaging 11.5 fantasy points per game in the last 34 regular season healthy games he has participated in. This offense has 110 targets vacated based on the disappearance of Richie James Jr., Kenny Golladay, and Marcus Johnson. I think Darren Waller immediately makes an impact and is once again fantasy relevant. Moving on. Let's talk about Dallas Goedert. Now, Dallas Goedert is a special player. He has been a top 12 ranked tight end in 3 out of the last 4 seasons. Some of those years, even with Zach Ertz active within this lineup. Now, overall, when we go into the 2023 year, we should see much of the same from Dallas Goedert. Specifically, I'm talking about his overall pace of play prior to his injury. From weeks 1 through 10 of last year, he was averaging 10.21 fantasy points per game and was the number 4 overall ranked tight end throughout that span of time. Now, if in fact you were going ahead and taking that entire pace of play, expanding it upon 17 games and predicting where he could have finished last season, we're talking about 78 receptions, nearly 1,000 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns, and 162.5 fantasy points. If in fact he played the full year. That's tight end 4 last season. That's the kind of potential that Dallas Goedert has. And considering he set career highs in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and catch rate with a 79.71% catch rate, nearly 80%. And because of that catch rate, the conversions of those opportunities certainly lead to his success. I mean, this is a guy that literally never leaves the field. Since Zach Ertz has left the organization, in 18 of the last 25 games, including the playoffs, we have seen Dallas Goedert play 90% of the offensive snaps. He is not going to leave the field. He's going to get himself opportunities. Obviously, we'd love to see him get more opportunities down in the red zone, but that's probably an unlikely, overall situation. Unfortunately, because this team loves to run the ball in the red zone. Last season, 69% of their overall attempts in the red zone, whether it's passing attempts or rushing attempts, were on the ground, whether it was from Miles Sanders, Jalen Hurts, etc. So he's probably not going to get as many touchdowns as some of these other options, but certainly will have the opportunity in terms of receptions and receiving yards. Moving on, let's talk about Kyle Pitts. Now, coming out of college, we looked at the prospect of Kyle Pitts, a 6'6" receiver, 4.4 40-yard dash speed, incredible athletic ability. I mean, we expected him to immediately find success, and that's what he did. So at the end of the season, in terms of his total fantasy points score, no one as a rookie has ever scored that many fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format, which really shouldn't have been a surprise. But going into 2022, everything fell apart. Marcus Mariota wasn't as good as we anticipated, especially with Kyle Pitts and the contributions he was getting, the overall opportunity far more inaccurate than we anticipated. Now, even though Kyle Pitts was targeted 27.7% of the routes that he ran last season, he still only averaged 6.2 fantasy points per game. With opportunity, he is able to find success. I mean, throughout his entire career, even though he's played 25 games, 12 of those games have consisted of 4 or more receptions. In those games, averaging 11.5 fantasy points per game. That's the kind of opportunity we need. Get him the ball actively, and in an offense that obviously wants to go ahead and utilize the tight end position, considering Arthur Smith has targeted his tight ends the 5th most times over the course of the last 2 seasons. It doesn't matter where you line up Kyle Pitts, whether it's out wide 77% of the time or even in the slot, there is going to be a high likelihood for him to find mismatches, line up against linebackers and or safeties, and be able to dominate because of how great of an athlete he is overall. With a target vacancy of 118 targets within this offense, even with Desmond Ridder, we should expect to see Kyle Pitts far better than he was last season. Moving on, let's talk about David Njoku. David Njoku, one of the guys that I planted a flag on last season, and he absolutely delivered, primarily because of the quarterbacks he was associated with and the offense he's associated with. Again, since 2020, since Kevin Stefanski has become the head coach of this organization and primary play caller, the Cleveland Browns have targeted their tight ends the 4th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League. Now, in terms of what David Njoku was able to accomplish last season with Jacoby Brissett, was averaging 8.48 fantasy points per game, was the number 7 overall tight end in terms of a fantasy point per game average prior to his injury while playing throughout the first 9 games of the season. If you were to take that overall opportunity that he was being given and expand it upon a full 17-game season, we would have very easily found David Njoku in the top-tier tight end conversation last season. But unfortunately, he got injured, and then Deshaun Watson came back, and with Deshaun Watson, wasn't great, was only averaging 7.34 fantasy points per game, was the number 15 overall tight end throughout that span of time in terms of a fantasy point per game average. That all being said, I do expect this offense to get back to throwing the ball to the tight end position because they've gone ahead and established that over the course of the last 3 years. And even Deshaun Watson back in 2019 and in 2020 with his tight ends, in both of those years, was able to get 100 targets in the direction of his tight ends and over 70 receptions as an accumulation of those overall opportunities, and also getting themselves a lot of red zone help, having scored 16 touchdowns with tight ends throughout those 2 seasons. Hopefully David Njoku steps up this year with the opportunity on hand. Moving on, we have Evan Engram. Listen, Evan Engram, he's associated with an offense that should be throwing the ball a bunch, and if that's going to be the case, of course we would assume that Evan Engram is going to get opportunities, but there are a lot of receiving threats within this offense. Calvin Ridley, Zay Jones, Christian Kirk, even the backfield, whether it's Travis Etienne and or Tanks Bigsby, there are going to be guys out here that are vying for targets, which may hurt Evan Ingram's overall baseline of value. We know that last season there was a lot of inconsistency from Evan Engram, producing only 6 games of more than 10 fantasy points and 9 games of less than 6 fantasy points. You primarily can't start someone like that. Despite the fact that he's associated with Doug Peterson, who has allowed a tight end within his offense to be a tight end 1, top 12 ranked within the season in 6 out of the last 6 seasons. Despite that, there is still a lot of risk involved with Evan Engram. That all being said, we did see from weeks 13 through 18 and even into the playoffs, this organization highlight Evan Engram as one of their priority receiving options. And if they're going to continue that, Evan Engram has a lot more upside than we potentially anticipate. But if the inconsistencies start to grow, if the target share is not going to go in his direction far more often than we saw last season, especially when you add Calvin Ridley into this offense, it's going to be tough for him to compete. Nonetheless, still has a lot of athleticism and value within the Jacksonville Jaguars passing attack. Moving on, Pat Freiermuth, another one of these inconsistent tight ends. I mean, I say inconsistent, but they are consistent because their consistency revolves around being good half the time and being awful the rest of the time. I mean, specifically last year, Pat Freiermuth, 7 games of over 10 fantasy points and 7 games of less than 6 fantasy points. We are going to struggle with some of these tight ends, and that's where the bottleneck begins to build. After Kyle Pitts, it gets very tricky at the tight end position, but with that all being said, we're talking about a tight end that in the last 2 years is averaging 7.45 fantasy points per game in games in which he played with a healthy Kenny Pickett. 9 total contests last season, was only averaging 6.86 fantasy points per game, averaging 6.2 targets, 4.2 receptions, 48 receiving yards, and 0 touchdowns. Now, if you expand that upon a 17-game season, he has the potential of 70 receptions and 800 receiving yards, a sprinkle of a couple touchdowns. We're in a beautiful spot, especially if, in fact, we expect Kenny Pickett to take steps forward, which, in my opinion, I expect him as a quarterback to be far better than what he presented last season. In an offense that has targeted their tight ends the 6th most times over the course of the last 2 seasons and plays 97% of their offensive snaps with at least one tight end on the field, I'm expecting Pat Freiermuth to continue to be relevant. Moving on, Tyler Higbee to close out the E tier. So here's the thing about Tyler Higbee. Outside of Cooper Kupp, there really isn't anybody else within this offense that is going to vie for targets at a high clip. Considering the fact that Tyler Higbee had himself 108 targets last season, this offense uses 11 personnel outright more than any other team in the National Football League, playing 11 personnel 90% of the time, and at least having one tight end on the field 99% of the time. there is a conversation to be had as to what the potential upside of Tyler Higbee looks like, especially if he's utilized down in the red zone. Over the course of the last 2 years, he's been targeted in the red zone 24% of the routes that he's ran, and within the 10-yard line, 26% of the routes that he's ran. If in fact Cooper Kupp is going to get himself double covered on the opposite side of the field, if the running game at any point stagnates this season, we're expecting Tyler Higbee to be the security blanket of Matthew Stafford going into the 2023 year. Moving on, let's talk about the F tier, beginning with Chigoziem Okonkwo, one of my favorite young up-and-coming tight ends. This is a tight end that is 6'3", 240 pounds, ran a 4.5 40 at the combine. He has the athleticism, and he demonstrated that last year, commanding a 25% target share on the routes that he ran last year, and demonstrated last season with those opportunities can be just as effective as someone like Travis Kelce, to be honest. Last season, tight ends with at least a minimum of 40 targets last year. Amongst all of them, Chigoziem Okonkwo was ranked number 1 in terms of yards per route run with a 2.61 average and yards after the catch per reception with a 7.81 average. There is so much potential within this offense for the Tennessee Titans for Chigoziem Okonkwo to come in and immediately be the number 2 receiving threat outside of DeAndre Hopkins. When that ends up being the case, considering the fact that Ryan Tannehill has targeted his tight ends in terms of a target share usage, 28% in 2020, 20% in 2021, 24% last season. If those numbers continue to trend in the right direction, I expect to see Chigoziem Okonkwo be a fantastic overall tight end, considering there is no more Austin Hooper to take away targets, and there is a 200 target vacancy within this offense. Last season, from weeks 13 through 18, averaged 8.23 fantasy points per game and was the number 11 overall tight end throughout that span of time, regardless of who was at quarterback, whether it was Ryan Tannehill or Malik Willis, or even Dobbs. With a multitude of quarterbacks, he can deliver, and he'll absolutely be able to do so in 2023. Moving on, we have Dalton Kincaid, the first rookie tight end I want to mention. I currently have him ranked as my number 13 tight end because it is difficult for a tight end to come in and immediately make a top 12 standing in their rookie year. It is very uncommon that we have witnessed that occur. I mean, some of the better rookie tight end performances over the course of the last decade, or potentially even the last 5-6 years, consist of Kyle Pitts, Pat Freiermuth, and Evan Engram. Really, there aren't that many that have been able to get into this top tier conversation immediately, yet Dalton Kincaid's different because he's not just a tight end. He is going to be used as a wide receiver. He's going to be the Travis Kelce of this offense potentially. There's a reason why this organization went out and made a first-round selection, 25th overall for Dalton Kincaid, because yes, they do have Dawson Knox, and they've utilized Dawson Knox at a pretty high clip, considering Knox, in the last 30 regular season games he's played, he has scored 15 receiving touchdowns, has ranked as the number 8 and number 14 tight end in the last 2 years. Those opportunities are great, but I expect to see Dalton Kincaid immediately make an impact within this offense, especially considering he has the ability to line up out wide and be a receiver. I mean, just looking at his statistics from Utah in 2022, 96 targets, 70 receptions, 890 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns. If you go ahead and look at his overall utilization in the preseason, he ran 13 routes with the first team offense this preseason. Of those 13 routes, 10 of them lined up in the slot, twice lined up out wide, and once in the inline. He is going to be used as a wide receiver and the primary slot receiver of this offense. Last season, they targeted slot receiving options 191 times last season of the 573 total passing attempts within this offense. If we go ahead and see Dalton Kincaid accumulate 80 plus targets, we are not going to be surprised, even while Dawson Knox stays active within this offense in a lot of 12 personnel sets. Moving on to Dalton Schultz. Now, Dalton Schultz in the last 2 years has finished as tight end 3 and tight end 10. Yes, he dealt with a lot of injuries last season, yet he was still able to produce a top 10 tight end standing, primarily because of the opportunities that Dallas Cowboys granted to him with 89 plus targets in each of the last 3 years. So now that Dalton Schultz joins the Houston Texans, there is going to be obviously a little bit of a learning curve for him overall with the rookie quarterback CJ Stroud. But if he could be the security blanket of this offense, considering the fact that the Houston Texans have a 343 target vacancy, majority of the starters within that offense that were catching the ball are no longer there. So this is a completely clean slate with a new offensive coordinator, new head coach. Again, this offensive coordinator, Bobby Slowick, formerly a passing game coordinator for Kyle Shanahan and the San Francisco 49ers in the last couple of years. If you go ahead and utilize Dalton Schultz like they utilize someone like George Kittle over in San Francisco, you got to remember, Dalton Schultz, according to Pro Football Focus, is a top 5 ranked blocking tight end in the league. So if, in fact, we're going to get into a situation where he's never coming off the field, he's a primary blocking tight end and can obviously leak out and work up the seam and make plays, we're going to see a lot of potential upside for Dalton Schultz, someone who has already proven over the course of the last 2 years, averaging 9.78 fantasy points per game in the last 34 games that he has played. He has the potential of being a top 15 tight end, if not better. Moving on. Let's talk about Juwan Johnson. I like Juwan Johnson a lot. He's a young tight end at the age of 26. He has proven that he can be a top 12 tight end, was able to accomplish that last season. Obviously, the New Orleans Saints have brought in a lot more talent within the tight end position. They brought in Foster Moreau this offseason and Jimmy Graham. They still have Taysom Hill, and that does make it a little bit tricky. But when you look at the potential of what Juwan Johnson could present and kind of provide this upcoming season, the fact that in the preseason played 100% of the first string offensive snaps with Derek Carr, we might end up seeing Derek Carr elevate Juwan Johnson to the levels in which we've seen Jared Cook or Darren Waller or Foster Moreau in the last couple years. Specifically, 2018 through 2022, Las Vegas Raiders targets. Starting from 2018, we had 130, the following year 161, the following year 172, following year 141, and then last year, obviously with the offensive coordinator, head coach change, we had 101 total targets for the tight end position. If we get back to those higher clip numbers, which we probably will end up seeing, Juwan Johnson has a lot of potential within this offense with Derek Carr as he elevates the quarterback position in comparison to what Jameis Winston and or Andy Dalton was providing last season. Now, Juwan Johnson is a special player, but amongst all the tight ends who have been able to accomplish a top 12 standing in a half PPR since 2010, he's one of only 10 tight ends who's been able to accomplish that with less than 72 targets within that given year, joining players like Kmet, Goedert, Taysom Hill, Robert Tonyan, Jonnu Smith, Jared Cook, and Rob Gronkowski back in 2018. We're talking about a lot of tight ends that have been able to produce high levels of overall fantasy success, but the primary statistic that all of them share is a lot of touchdowns. Juwan Johnson was able to score a bunch last season. We're hoping for that once again this year. Moving on, let's talk about Cole Kmet. Now, while we're on the subject of talking about tight ends who have been able to rank within the top 12, but unfortunately, we're not able to get more than 72 targets in that given year, Cole Kmet is a part of that list. Of course, joining Juwan Johnson, Dallas Goedert, Taysom Hill last season, Robert Tonyan, Jonnu Smith. There are a lot of tight ends over the course of the last couple of years who have dominated because of touchdowns, and that's exactly what Cole Kmet did last year. If you go ahead and look at his overall number, 7 receiving touchdowns on 50 receptions. That overall touchdown rate is ridiculous, but then again, who else was Justin Fields really going to throw the ball to? So finding himself a lot of success with Cole Kmet, not really much of a surprise, but can we consistently find such success in 2023, considering you bring in other receiving threats like a DJ Moore who may end up getting more targets and siphoning that away from Cole Kmet, considering the fact that they also signed a guy like Robert Tonyan. This all being taken into account, we got to remember that with Justin Fields last season from weeks 5 through 17, Cole Kmet was averaging 8.75 fantasy points per game, but in terms of targets per game was not in a great spot. If you take his overall averages with Fields throughout that span of time, expanded upon a 17-game season, we're talking about 77 targets and 59 receptions within the given year. If he doesn't score a handful of touchdowns at minimum, he is not going to be in this top 16 conversation. It's going to be a little bit tricky for Cole Kmet, but that's how it works at the tight end position with so many of these players relying upon touchdowns. Moving on, let's talk about Sam LaPorta, another one of these rookie tight ends. Already has been named the starting tight end of this team. He took over Brock Wright's position earlier on in the month of August. We saw that Brock Wright was considered the starting tight end. That has already changed within the depth chart. He is going to be the TJ Hockenson replacement within this offense. And quite frankly, there is a lot of opportunity considering the Detroit Lions last season amongst all teams in the National Football League were amongst the top in terms of tight end touchdowns last year. And hopefully, if that rate continues into this year, Sam LaPorta should be able to develop all of those opportunities down in the red zone or between the 20s. I mean, when you go ahead and take over TJ Hawkinson's role, TJ Hockenson in 2020, weeks 1 through 17, was the number 4 overall tight end. Averaged 8.86 fantasy points per game. You go to 2021, TJ Hockenson, prior to his injury, weeks 1 through 13, averaged 9.57 fantasy points per game, was the number 3 overall tight end throughout that span of time. You go to last season, prior to the trade, TJ Hockenson, averaging 10.36 fantasy points per game, was the number 5 overall tight end in fantasy. TJ Hockenson improved every single year within this offense and was given a boatload of opportunity when he was healthy and on the field. I mean, overall, last season, he had a 20.38% target percentage in terms of targets per route run. He had a total of 211 routes run and 43 targets. If Sam LaPorta, who's coming off of a pretty good year at Iowa, with a total of 58 receptions, 657 receiving yards, there is a potential in which he makes an immediate impact with this offense, considering no one else besides Jahmyr Gibbs and Amon-Ra St. Brown are vying for targets. Moving on, let's talk about Jake Ferguson. I truly do believe the absence of Dalton Schultz will provide Jake Ferguson a lot of fantasy value. Now, there is a chance that Luke Schumacher, the second-round pick of this organization, a tight end, is going to immediately make an impact, but Schumacher has predominantly been a blocking tight end, and I think that's how they're going to utilize him. They're going to give him sprinkles of opportunity, but Ferguson, like Dak Prescott said earlier last week, he could potentially be a quote-unquote big-time player in this league. If, in fact, Jake Ferguson sees similar levels of opportunity that Dalton Schultz had, specifically 89 targets minimum in each of the last 3 seasons. There's a potential in which Jake Ferguson could be of fantasy relevance, especially considering Dalton Schultz last season from week 7 through 18, when Dak Prescott was healthy, was averaging 9.5 fantasy points per game, was the number 7 overall tight end in terms of fantasy points per game on average throughout that span of time. It was incredible. Hopefully, Jake Ferguson will be able to pick up the torch and keep it moving for the tight end position for the Dallas Cowboys. Moving on, we have Gerald Everett. Now, Gerald Everett in the last couple years has moved around to a couple teams, was a part of the Rams, then went to the Seahawks, and now, obviously, this is his second year with the Los Angeles Chargers. He was pretty good last year overall, including the playoffs, was averaging 7.94 fantasy points per game, predominantly benefited from the fact that there was an injured Donald Parham, Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, etc. Now that you go ahead and make an addition to this offense with Quentin Johnston, and you have the rest of the receiving core healthy, there is a potential in which his overall target share decreases. But specifically last season, the Los Angeles Chargers, they targeted their tight ends the 9th most times amongst all teams. Specifically, Kellen Moore and the Dallas Cowboys from 2019 through 2022, they targeted their tight ends the 9th most times throughout that 4-year span. So if, in fact, we want to end up seeing the potential of a Dalton Schultz level of opportunity go in the direction of Gerald Everett, then by all means, he's far lower ranked, but I don't expect that to be the case. I think they're going to get their other receiving options, whether it's out of the backfield or whether it's one of these stud wide receivers, far more opportunities, which will decrease the overall potential of Gerald Everett. Nonetheless, I do expect him to be in this top 17 to 18 overall rankings, because regardless of whether it's been Gerald Everett and or Jared Cook in the last couple years, Chargers tight ends are always somewhat relevant. Moving on, let's talk about Hayden Hurst. Hayden Hurst joins a new team. Obviously, was with the Cincinnati Bengals last season. If you go back even seasons prior to that, like 2020, with the Atlanta Falcons, was a fantastic option. In fact, was a top 10 ranked tight end in fantasy football in a half PPR scoring format with Matt Ryan that year. And when given opportunity over the course of 2020 through 2022, in terms of 5 or more targets, we have seen Hayden Hurst average 8.44 fantasy points per game. Again, there's going to be a lot of opportunity, primarily because Frank Wright, the head coach of this team, from 2018 through 2021, he targeted his tight ends with the Indianapolis Colts as he was the head coach over there, the 5th most times amongst all teams in the National Football League, the offensive coordinator of this organization. He is the former passing game coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams. They targeted their tight ends 121 times last year. Hayden Hurst wasn't signed to this organization by accident. They want to use a tight end, so absolutely he will not be coming off the field, and if Bryce Young finds himself a rapport with Hayden Hurst, could be of immense fantasy value. Moving on to the final member of the G tier, we have Irv Smith. Now, speaking of Hayden Hurst, he left Cincinnati, and then they replaced him now with Irv Smith Jr. Irv Smith Jr. throughout his entire career has never been the tight end one of an offense. He's dealt with a lot of injuries, specifically in 2021, meniscus tear. In 2022, had a hand-finger sprain that obviously forced him to miss some time, and then eventually after had himself an ankle sprain that was grade 3, forced the Minnesota Vikings to trade for TJ Hockenson, and then the rest was history. But we have seen the tight end position within the Cincinnati Bengals offense be relevant. I mean, specifically in the last 2 years, Hayden Hurst ranked as tight end 24 and CJ Uzomah ranked as tight end 20. So if in fact we're going to be in a conversation in which Irv Smith joins this organization, he's going to get similar levels of opportunity, he should probably rank as such. And that's pretty much where I have him. Now, he has demonstrated that he has a lot of athleticism and a lot of ability. And when given opportunity in terms of 5 or more targets, is averaging over 10 fantasy points per game throughout his career. It's just a matter of, can he get over 5 targets per game on average? I mean, Hayden Hurst last season was averaging 5.23 targets per game. So all we need is opportunity to go in his direction. There are a lot of receiving threats within this offense to compete with, but still, as long as Irv Smith stays healthy, could be a decent tight end too. Moving on to Greg Dulcich. Greg Dulcich is heavily dropped in my overall rankings, primarily because throughout the preseason, with the first team offense, Adam Trotman played 100% of the offensive snaps on first and second downs. Even though that they say that Greg Dulcich is going to be the joker of this offense, we've also heard Sean Payton say the joker of our offense has typically been running backs who can catch the ball out of the backfield. So if that's going to be the case, it's similar to where it's been with guys like Reggie Bush, Darren Sproles, Pierre Thomas, Alvin Kamara in seasons past, it should be Javonte Williams this year and not Greg Dulcich. And that's pretty much where it's kind of trending in the direction of. Even though Greg Dulcich is within an offense that has an offensive coordinator and head coach that have heavily utilized their tight ends over the course of their careers within their offensive schemes, I want to temper my overall expectations with Greg Dulcich, because really he didn't prove much in year one for me to be 1,000% confident about his overall role within this offense, especially considering his overall snaps in the first team kind of presence that we have seen within the preseason not be great enough to justify a higher ranking. Moving on, we talk about Noah Fant. Noah Fant was in an offense last year that was number 5 in terms of overall tight end targets, number 3 in tight end receptions, number 3 in tight end receiving yards, and number 4 in tight end receiving touchdowns. The entire tight end room of the Seattle Seahawks accumulated 136 targets, 110 receptions, 1,164 receiving yards, and 10 receiving touchdowns. Now, of those overall touches, opportunities, yards, touchdowns, we only saw Noah Fant pretty much get about 45% of the targets, 45% of the receptions, 42% of the receiving yards, and 40% of the touchdowns. So despite the fact that they utilize their tight end position a lot, Will Disley, Colby Parkinson, there are other guys there that are siphoning away value. Therefore, Noah Fant cannot be trusted. And with Jackson Smith and Jigba within this offense, of course, alongside DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, you bring in Zach Charbonnet. That just means less and less opportunity for Noah Fant going forward. Moving on, Tyler Conklin. Tyler Conklin in the last 2 seasons, whether it's been with the Jets and or the Vikings, has got himself a minimum of 87 targets. So with the new variables within this offense of Aaron Rodgers and Nathaniel Hackett, new quarterback and new offensive coordinator, you got to remember the two of them were able to help Robert Tonyan back in 2020, elevate his game and score 11 receiving touchdowns that year and be the number 3 overall tight end in fantasy. Is that going to happen this year for Tyler Conklin? Probably not. But I expect him to get far more utilization within this offense now that Corey Davis is out and there isn't as much veteran presence within this offense available. The tight end position is important within the scheme, so Conklin will get himself a pretty decent amount of utilization. Moving on, Dawson Knox. Dawson Knox, like I mentioned earlier, has finished as tight end 14 and tight end 8. There's nothing to say that he can't do that once again. But I'm expecting to see Dalton Kincaid join this offense, and even though Dalton Kincaid will line up out wide in the slot in the inline, predominantly he's going to be a wide receiver. He isn't going to be blocking. So if in fact they're going to run a lot of 12 personnel, there may be opportunities for Dawson Knox to have himself, success in the red zone or continue to get himself a handful of targets. But ultimately, Dawson Knox has lived and died by touchdowns. Scoring 15 touchdowns in the last 30 regular season games is pretty much elevated him to his overall success. Outside of that, his consistency hasn't been great, scoring 11 games of more than 10 fantasy points and 14 games of less than 7 fantasy points. That's why I have him currently at this tier. Moving on to Mike Gesicki to close out the H tier. So here's the kind of idea that I have regarding Mike Gesicki. In the last 3 seasons where he was utilized properly, 2019, 2020, and 2021, finished as tight end 11, 8, and 11, with 128 fantasy points, 132, and 111. If, in fact, we see the New England Patriots utilize Mike Gesicki as he's intended to be, as a slot receiver, someone who's played 71, 67, 63% of his routes run from the slot position in those 3 successful years for fantasy campaigns, if this offense is going to elevate and they, obviously are looking for firepower as they brought in Juju Smith-Schuster and Mike Gesicki, if they're going to utilize these guys, absolutely Mike Gesicki has the ability to overthrow Hunter Henry, immediately make an impact, not only between the 20s, but down in the red zone, as we've seen Bill O'Brien, the current offensive coordinator of his team back in the days where he was the head coach, primary play caller for the Houston Texans. They utilized a lot of their tight end overall usage down in the red zone. Hopefully that'll be the case for Mike Gesicki. Moving on, let's talk about the final tier, the final couple players. We begin with Luke Musgrave, another one of these rookie tight ends. The 11th overall pick of the second round of the 2023 fantasy football draft. He didn't have an overall incredible stat line from college, but what he presents right now is the fact that this organization no longer has Robert Tonyan and Mercedes Lewis. He is the starting tight end based on weeks 1 and 2 of the preseason. The fact that he played all of the offensive snaps with the first team and was targeted 6 times by Jordan Love. I truly do believe they're going to continue to utilize Luke Musgrave over the course of the season. And even though I've ranked him in the I tier, he has the potential of being fantasy relevant if, in fact, the opportunities continue to go in his direction. Moving on, we have Cade Otton. Now, Cade Otton last season with Tom Brady was heavily inconsistent, primarily because Tom Brady had other receiving threats that he wanted to throw the ball to, whether it was out of the backfield or to one of his 2 primary studs, Godwin or Evans. Now, Cade Otton with Baker Mayfield has a potential higher opportunity for success, primarily because if these other receiving options are all being double covered, there is a chance that we could end up seeing Cade Otton be relevant. I mean, when we look back at the success of tight ends with Baker Mayfield, 2018, David Njoku was tight end 9, fantastic. Last season with Tyler Higbee, weeks 14 through 18, he elevated Tyler Higbee to being the number 6 overall tight end in terms of total fantasy points scored throughout that time and number 8 in terms of fantasy points per game on average, 6 targets per game, 9.32 fantasy points per game, obviously found the end zone a good amount of times. There is a potential where Cade Otton could be of value within an offense that is going to be in a lot of negative game scripts. Moving on, we talk about Trey McBride. Of all of the potential options that we have talked about, whether they're second-year options and or rookies, Trey McBride has one of the most incredible final seasons of college that I have seen to date. I mean, you go back to 2021 Colorado State, you go watch his highlights. We're talking about a guy who had 90 receptions and 1,100 receiving yards in his final year of college. Now, even though he didn't get a lot of opportunity last year with Zach Ertz within this offense, there is a lot of conversation with Zach Ertz coming back from the ACL and this team obviously looking and trending towards the direction of tanking, that they may trade Zach Ertz to an offense that is a potential playoff, contender for the coming weeks. Perhaps we've heard, some conversations about Zach Ertz being traded to the Cowboys. There are some conversations obviously looming, but if in fact we're going to see Zach Ertz slow to return, Trey McBride could very easily be one of these tight ends that steps up within their offense with not very much, target competition within the entire, conversation. Moving on, let's talk about Michael Mayer. Another one of these rookie tight ends. He joins the Las Vegas Raiders organization. They spent high draft capital for him primarily because, again, they're replacing Foster Moreau and Darren Waller. I know they signed Austin Hooper, and Austin Hooper has been a nightmare for both Chigoziem Okonkwo and David Njoku in the last 2 seasons. Hopefully that won't be the case for Michael Mayer. Michael Mayer in the last 2 seasons of college. 2021, 99 targets, 71 catches, 840 yards, 7 receiving touchdowns. 2022, 105 targets, 67 receptions, 809 yards, 9 receiving touchdowns. Both years at Notre Dame, incredible. They need a tight end, and we know Jimmy G obviously loves to target his tight ends with George Kittle in the past. Hopefully, he'll be far better than where I have him currently ranked. Those are my top 30 tight ends. The only other player that I haven't mentioned that I obviously want to make a couple comments regarding, my number 31 would be Taysom Hill. Taysom Hill, we don't know what this offense is going to kind of consist of, considering they brought in a consistent quarterback with Derek Carr replacing Jameis Winston and Andy Dalton. So really, you won't ask, Taysom Hill to throw the ball as much. I mean, they may ask him to throw a couple deep shots to Rashid Shaheed, but nothing crazy. You brought in a goal line back that scored 17 rushing touchdowns last season for the Detroit Lions by the name of Jamal Williams. You still have Alvin Kamara. This team did end up drafting Miller, who could end up being relevant. And then you also brought in guys like Foster Moreau and Jimmy Graham for the tight end room, who will obviously run potentially more routes than Taysom Hill. I don't know what they're doing, but eventually Taysom Hill will be fantasy relevant this season. We just have to see what kind of a role he has within this offense because they have not spoiled anything for us this offseason. All right, that's going to cover it for me today. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Again, don't forget, subscribe to the channel. We're trying to provide as much information as possible so that you can not only make informed decisions on your upcoming drafts, but for trades, for, of course, start or sits for the entirety of the 2023 season so we can help you capture a fantasy football championship. Additionally, for those of you who have not yet already, be sure to go down to the description of the video, sign up via Underdog Fantasy using code Andrew, make that first time deposit. You'll get my draft guide, you'll get the rankings, and then you'll additionally get rankings every single Sunday morning, weeks 1 through 18, half PPR, full PPR, flex, by position, by tier, everything that you need in order to capture yourself a fantasy football championship. Lastly, be sure to go ahead, check out AndrewKiorkofShop.com, link down in the description. So whether it's one of these tie-dye hoodies, be sure to represent greetings and salutations and support the channel. Thank you very much. Until tomorrow, we'll be talking about the quarterback position. I'll see you guys. Peace.